I wore the Omnipod 5 insulin pump for 68 days, and I had really high hopes for this system. I really wanted it to work for me, and some parts were absolutely brilliant. For one, this system let me sleep through the night, but when I took off my last pod, it was honestly such a relief. Over those 2 months, I dealt with leaking insulin pods, painful infusion sites, dropped signal, and an algorithm that constantly was fighting the way that I like to manage my blood sugars. On paper, Omnipod 5 looks almost perfect, and I really love a lot of things about it. In reality, it became one of the most frustrating diabetes devices that I've tried, but also one of the most impressive, because when this system worked, it really worked. And along the way, I also learned some really neat tricks that helped me get my average blood sugars closer to target. So in this video, I'll be showing you what really worked, what didn't work that well, where I think this system could be really great for, and I'll also tell you why that I, after 28 years of mostly using insulin pens, are going back to that, at least for now. I think the biggest strength of Omnipod 5, and honestly, also one of its biggest frustrations, is the algorithm. The algorithm is basically the brains of the system. It constantly looks at your blood sugars and adjusts the amount of insulin delivered from the pod in the background without you having to do anything. Quick side note here, just to rule out any confusion, you'll hear me say both insulin pump, as well as pod. Insulin pump and pump is a general term, whereas pod, that refers directly to the Omnipod, which I guess because it doesn't have any tubing. For this system to work, you also need a CGM, so continuous glucose monitor, such as the Dexcom or the Freestyle Libre. The CGM sends blood sugar data to the pod, and together they create a constant feedback loop. I use Dexcom G7, and every 5 minutes, the Omnipod will adjust how much insulin delivers based on that reading. That's brilliant. Whenever my blood sugars would start to trend low, it would either dial back the insulin or stop it altogether. If my blood sugars start to rise, it would give me more insulin. So instead of giving manual corrections or going low due to too much long-acting insulin on board, this system constantly adjusts the insulin in the background. You can see it right here. So the black dots are my blood sugars, and those red blocks, they indicate whenever the system would pull back insulin to help prevent a low blood sugar. And this is what makes this system so forgiving. If you slightly over or underdose for a meal, the algorithm will be working in the background trying to pull you back to target. It does not replace carb counting all meal boluses or meal doses, but it does create a safety net in the background as it tries to mimic a healthy pancreatic system. And when it worked well, I was blown away, especially overnight. But theory and real life are not always the same thing. And this is where it quite quickly went sideways for me, because the first major issue for me was the blood sugar target. The lowest target you can set on Omnipod 5 is 110 milligram per deciliter. And honestly, I would be completely okay with that if the system actually kept me around 110. But in reality, the algorithm became so aggressive about preventing lows that every time I started getting close to the target, it would pull back insulin. So instead of me averaging close to 110, my blood sugars were usually closer to 130. And just to be clear, 130 is not a bad blood sugar at all. I know a lot of people would be thrilled with this, and I am at certain times. But for me personally, I can usually achieve similar or sometimes better results on MDI, so multiple daily injections. So I went into this hoping for tighter control. Instead, I got, slightly better time in range, but also slightly higher average glucose and a higher projected A1C. And I think this really comes down to management philosophy. Omnipod 5 prioritizes safety very heavily. This system really does not want you to go low, which honestly is great for most people, especially if you're concerned about hypoglycemia. But personally, I prefer to run a little closer to 100 with a little bit more variation. And this system just constantly pushed me up towards an average that was just higher than where I want to be. So while the algorithm really impressed me, I also felt like it was fighting me all the time. And that also spilled over into mealtimes. Because this system is so aggressive about preventing low blood sugars, it would pretty much constantly reduce my background insulin. And that just meant that I had very little insulin on board at all times, and I would need a lot of insulin to cover even small meals. Usually my carb ratio, so carb ratio is how many carbs are covered by 1 unit of insulin. That's usually around 10. On Omnipod 5, it was between 6 and 8. Normally, I really don't care how much insulin I have to take to manage my blood sugars. My body needs what my body needs. But this just made it somewhat challenging to manage blood sugars around mealtime. I also found that for me, the pod didn't seem to handle large boluses or large doses very well. I had 2 pods leak insulin during bigger doses. And leaked insulin obviously does not lower blood sugars. It was really easy for me to tell when I had leaky insulin pods. So first of all, I could smell it. You know, the smell of insulin is really strong. I could feel that it was wet around the pod. I could also just see that the insulin was leaking into the tape around the pod. I know plenty of Omnipod users who rarely, if ever, have leaky pods. So, I mean, I had 2 in 2 months. It could also be related to where I place the pods. And I'll talk more about that a little later. Let's move on to what I think is the second pro of the Omnipod 5 system, and that is how easy it is to use. The pod has no tubing. You just fill it with insulin and you stick it directly on the body. You do have to fill a new pod every 3 days, and you also get an 8-hour grace period, which makes it a little easier with the timing. I'm using an insulin pen fill here because that's what I had, but most people will probably use an insulin vial. Filling it was not difficult, although it did take me a few times to consistently avoid air bubbles. And once the pod is on body, it's really easy to use. You just add your carbohydrates if you're eating or drinking anything and give corrections throughout the day. Again, if needed. You can use either the Omnipod controller, so the PDM, or you can use the Omnipod app on your phone. You can't use both. I chose to use the app on my phone just because I don't want to carry around another device. A slightly odd thing is that you do need the PDM to activate the system. So even if you're only using the app, you can't get around buying one of these. The good news is that Omnipod has a try before you buy program that gives most people 30 days of pods plus a PDM for free. That's what I did. So if you're considering Omnipod 5, definitely check out whether or not you qualify for that. The initial setup was a bit of work. I'm not gonna lie here. And it was actually so much work that I'm considering doing a whole tutorial on that. So let me know if that's something you want to see. But once that is done, and you've done your pump training, which for me was 2 hours, so that was a Zoom call. Once all of that is done, dosing insulin with this system is super easy. The pump has a built-in dosing calculator that's not unique. Most insulin pumps, I think all insulin pumps have that. And I also have that with my smart insulin pen. But what I liked here was how seamless it all felt. With one click, I could pull in my CGM readings. I didn't have to type them in. I could just then enter my carbs, if I were eating any, and it would calculate the dose. With one click, that dose got delivered. I did not have to get a pen out or do anything further. And not having to constantly find my insulin pen was really nice. Very convenient. It reminded me a little of when I tried Secure. The same kind of convenience where dosing insulin just becomes very quick and easy. So if you dislike insulin injections, dislike needles, tend to forget to take your doses, or just want something that's a little bit more convenient, this might be a really good system for you. And the algorithm really handled my blood sugars beautifully overnight, not to 110, close to 130, but very stable. And I was also impressed of how well it was handling my dawn phenomenon. So that's that increase in blood sugars I usually see between 3 and 5 a.m. due to hormones. It did struggle more with my feet on the floor spike. So that's the spike that you can see in blood sugars when you get up in the morning, as well as some of my afternoon increases. So for those, I usually had to do manual injections with the pump. And doing that correction just meant tapping that button that automatically pulled in my CGM reading and then tap deliver insulin. Could the pump have fixed those highs on its own? Probably. It would just have taken it more time than I'm comfortable with, because what it does is it gives its tiny increase in the background insulin to reduce highs. It does not give big doses. And that is why I did that manually. And it's still less work than getting your insulin pen out every time. So it's super easy to use, but the pod itself also has some limitations. And these are the 5 that bothered me the most. First, you do have to change your pod every 3 days. Well, every 3 days and 8 hours. At first, I didn't think that would bother me one bit, but it turned out to be a bit more planning in the sense that I have no desire to walk around with a pod and insulin all the time. And I was trying to schedule those changes for when I was home. Second thing, These pods have to be filled with a minimum of 85 units of insulin, 80 to 85. And I don't always use that much insulin in 3 days, so I was wasting a lot of insulin. But the thing is, I sometimes do use that much insulin, so only filling it with 85 units is risky as well, as I might run out of insulin before the 3 days are up. So I'd usually fill it with about 120 units, give or take. Technically, you're not supposed to pull out insulin from a used pod, but I absolutely did, especially if there was more than 50 units left in the pod, because insulin is expensive. The pod tells you when you have less than 50 units left, and unfortunately, after those 3 days and 8 hours, the pump stops working and you can't continue to use it. And the third issue for me was pod placement. You have a lot of options when it comes to pod placements, but it has to stay on the same side of the body as your CDM, or the two can lose signal. And I had a lot of issues with dropped signal, even when the two devices were on the same side of the body. So for me, the system worked best if they were very close together. And yes, there are a lot of placement options, but in reality, I found it to be fairly limited. So I couldn't use thigh for one thing, mainly because this is where I had the leaky pods. I had horrible absorption, and there's also some pain. We'll talk more about that a little later. Back of the arm didn't work that well for me either. I found that the pods are really bulky to sleep on, and my mattress is fairly firm, so sleeping on it was uncomfortable. Lower back worked okay. The only issue there was things like leg press at the gym or airplane seats. Manageable, but still annoying. And the fourth issue was skin irritation. Even after just 3 days, the pod irritated my skin. And if I didn't use body oil to remove it, it would sometimes peel off the top layer of my skin. Dexcom does the same to me, so this is not unique to Omnipod, but still not great. And the fifth issue was painful insertion sites. So I think one of the worst ones were on my thigh. Again, I did not like the thigh placement. It must have been very close to a nerve muscle, because every time I would bend my legs, so like walking upstairs, I would have this shooting pain. And I was enduring this for way too long until I talked to my diabetes educator. She's like, take it off. So I took that one off and moved on to another pod. Another painful site happened on my arm, and that one I removed after only a few hours. But when the system worked, it really worked. And it definitely kept me safe from lows and in the 70 to 180 range most of the time. As I mentioned earlier, my average blood sugar ended up at 129 for the 2 months that I wore the Omnipod 5. Funny, look at that, 129. And it was very stable blood sugars, and some days were amazing. 129 average is just a little higher than where I want to be. And the system does take some time to get to know you. So it needs to learn your trends, so it can know how to adjust your insulin based on you. And generally it takes 2 to 5 weeks. I had read 2 weeks somewhere. The diabetes educator who trained me on the pump said 5 weeks. And I did find that the first 2 weeks were incredibly frustrating. But once it adjusted and got to know me, I had very few lows and my blood sugars did become less frustrating. The wild thing was that I could go on one of my 2-hour walks without going low. And I never even had to use exercise mode or change my mealtime doses. Exercise mode is a feature that you turn on in the app or on the PDM, and it changes your target from 110 or whatever you've set it to up to 150. So it's an extra safety feature. I never needed it because regardless of what I was doing, this pump would constantly keep me around 130. And I know an average of 130 is pretty darn good, and I can tell you my diabetes educator was thrilled. I just personally prefer to run a little closer to 100 with a little bit more variability. I don't want to go low though, but I can tell you that. I took half a unit. And I did find one trick that helped me lower my average blood sugars, at least for a while. By keeping a very strict routine and changing the insulin duration setting from 3 hours down to 2.5 hours, I was able to get much closer to that 110 target, at least for a while. My life isn't structured in a way that allows that level of consistency, and I don't really want it to be, but I think Omnipod 5 could probably be extremely brilliant for anyone who has a fairly set routine. So the algorithm learns by looking at your total insulin doses for the day for the last 72 hours. And I think that if you have a very set routine, that would make it way easier for the system to manage your blood sugars towards the target, that target of 110. But it does require that the hardware actually works. And unfortunately, I had my fair share of both pod as well as CGM malfunctions during those 2 months. Obviously, Omnipod is not responsible for the Dexcom performance, but if the Dexcom data is inaccurate, it is feeding the pump inaccurate information and it's delivering insulin based off, again, inaccurate information. And unfortunately, I had way more Dexcom issues during those 2 months than I usually do. To be fair, I was also measuring my blood sugars and calibrating the sensor much more than I normally do. My main issues were drop connection between the pod and the CGM, inaccurate sensor readings, and compression lows. Compression lows are those fake low blood sugars that you can get from, for example, when you're sleeping, if you're putting pressure on the sensor. So that will give you a faulty low reading. The problem with this system is that if the sensor is saying low blood sugar, the Omnipod 5 will cut off insulin delivery, which is fairly frustrating, especially if you're actually running high. I also had some pod failures aside from those leaky pods and the painful pods that we already talked about. I had one that completely malfunctioned, and luckily I was home and I could just change it out because, again, I did not want to walk around with extra pots and insulin. And then I had a screamer. This is a complete pot failure, and the alarm will continue to sound until you manually insert something sharp into the pot and turn it off. Luckily, I was also home for that failure. I guess I'm home a lot. So I could get out my toolbox and I could turn off that screaming pod. I'm not sure how I would have MacGyvered that if I'd been out for a walk. These malfunctions are, of course, unfortunate, and they can be outright dangerous. It can happen with any insulin pump though, and 89% of pump users report unexpected high blood sugars because of failures. So wearing an insulin pump definitely does not mean that you can stop thinking about diabetes altogether. You still have to pay attention. But despite all of that, Omnipod 5 gave me one thing that was honestly kind of amazing. It allowed me to sleep. Not having low blood sugars overnight and not having to get up to fix blood sugars was beyond amazing. And honestly, this is one of the main reasons why I would even consider getting an insulin pump again. Now, I do think that part of the reason why I was working out so well overnight is that the system was keeping me at that 120 to 130, which is higher than where I'm trying to keep myself when I'm managing with multiple daily injections. But I still really miss that part about Omnipod 5, sleeping through the night. But even though this system with all its bells and whistles isn't the right system for me, well, right now, I still think it can be an incredible tool for people who feel overwhelmed by multiple daily injections, who are struggling with dosing, or who are especially worried about low blood sugars. So if your main priority is safety, reducing lows, and limiting the burden of living with diabetes, I think Omnipod 5 can be a brilliant system, a brilliant option. Absolutely. And I'm not ruling it out for myself in the long run. I just might MacGyver it a little bit because I really, really appreciated those night times. I think you got that from this video. So what I'm considering is maybe I wear the Omnipod 5 only in auto mode, so using the algorithm overnight, and then do manual mode. So that means it's only delivered based on a fixed basal rate, and I do my mealtime injections during the day. So that would be an option? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, it doesn't take away from those product malfunctions that I had. So it's something to think about. And she just came up here to say bye-bye. Hey, babes.